presentations. Contrary to the common stereotype, starting a presentation with a joke or telling jokes at all in a presentation is generally the wrong way to execute a great idea, adding humor. So how can a speaker who's not a comedian bring a little lightheartedness to what they do? Loyd Auerbach is a bit of an eclectic mix: professor, author, professional speaker, parapsychologist, mentalist, and chocolatier. In his short presentation, Loyd Auerbach will talk about why humor can be such an important thing in presentation. He'll discuss how it can help you connect to an audience, hold their attention, and aid in their comprehension. He'll address how to choose a humorous approach that best suits your personality, and discuss simple ways for even the humor challenge to enhance any presentation. So please help me welcome Loyd Auerbach.
We have some handouts going around. How many of you have ever done presentations and had your projector just crap out on you? Okay, that happened to me. So, yeah, this happens all the time. So you'll see the first thing I want to mention, one of the things we've been talking about is the use of quotes to help you get points across. So a great quote from speaker Patricia Fripp is on this piece, and you're welcome to use it, of course. Winston Churchill went on radio and motivated a nation, all without a single PowerPoint slide. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit about how to inject a little bit of humor. Jokes are really bad if you don't know how to tell jokes. And anybody know what the best or the most important thing for telling a joke is? Timing. Timing. If you don't have comic timing, telling a joke can really screw you up. More importantly, if you tell the wrong joke to the wrong audience, you can offend people. Even telling the right joke to the right audience can offend people, at least one person in the audience. So you want to try not to lose anybody if possible. Humor is not the same as being funny. I'm hoping that, well, I'm here to talk about humor as a serious business, so I'm not sure how many laughs I'm actually going to get today. But we'll see as we go along. It's really not the same as being funny. If you want to get laughs, a lot of laughs, then you need to plan your presentation with a comedian. Have somebody write your material for you. And a lot of folks actually do that. They'll actually work with someone who's a comedy writer to put humor into their presentations. A lot of the more entertaining professional speakers out there in the circuit who get top dollar will do that. And so working with a writer, even a director, to kind of help you speak, that's not a bad thing. But don't try to be funny unless you've done stand-up comedy or know how to do that. It's important to consider that humor is going to help you be perceived as a human being and not just simply as a too serious expert. Approaching this with a bit of a light heart, I think is probably the best way to put it. The idea is that when you are at least a little bit lighthearted, people will take you for a normal person. We've all seen speakers or talked to people who take themselves way too seriously. I'm not talking about taking their subject too seriously, but taking themselves way too seriously. Do you like them? No. Okay. Do you listen to them? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. I mean, that's the problem, is that if somebody you can't relate to, you really have a hard time with. And someone who can't take criticism, the people who are too serious, are going to be difficult to deal with, and they're not seen with as much credibility a lot of times, even though they may have a lot of letters after their name, as some people who are very human and come across in a very relatable way. So there are a couple things that we'll talk about here. First of all, relevant humor is really important. When you use any sort of humor in your presentation, if you're going to inject something, whether it be a cartoon, which a lot of folks like to use, whether it be a quote, whether it be a joke, or something else that I'll get to in a little bit, it should be relevant to what you're talking about, or it should illustrate a point. It shouldn't just be something that you're tossing off. Because what's going to happen at that point is you're sidetracking the audience from your main points. And if you sidetrack the audience from your main points, you have to then get them back on track. It would be the equivalent of just simply changing the subject midstream and talking about something completely different, and then going back to that. So you don't want to do that. As much as you can, stick on point for that. And a lot of times you'll say something or do something that will get a laugh, and you may not know why. That's kind of humor of the moment. So you want to take advantage of that as much as possible. If that ever happens to you, we'll talk about this again in a moment, always write it down. And you can even make a joke about that. Like, what did I say that was so funny? Please somebody tell me so I can write this down and put it in my talk next time. That gets you another laugh on top of everything else. It makes you more human. It's a little self-effacing in that sense. which is always a good thing to play with. Now, there's a humor consultant by the name of Malcolm Kushner who's written quite a bit about using humor in business communication, and I've kind of quoted him here. There are certain benefits of using humor. The main benefit is it really does connect you with your audience and keeps their attention. There are several things that a good speaker in general tries to do to avoid monotony. And contrary to popular belief, monotony is not just the same tone. Monotony is also anything that is repetitive at all. So if you are using even variation of voice and pitch and you're doing it over and over and over again, some of your audience is going to go into a hypnotic trance. If you use the same hand motions over and over and over again, people fixate on that. And for those of you who are trying to become good speakers, videotape yourself, watch it fast forward, and look at your hands. And see if you're doing the same pacing back and forth, if you're moving your hand up and down the same way. Try to avoid monotony as much as you possibly can, because that helps you connect. Personally, I went to the William Shatner School of Speech. That means that I learned all of my speaking technique from watching Star Trek. It's a lot about changing your patterns and the volume. Stopping at the right points. And continuing on. It is the Captain Kirk School of Speech, so you can play with that a little bit too. Strangely enough, he was a Shakespearean trained actor. A lot of people don't know that. Okay, so it helps you, humor can help you connect with the audience, it can help you build rapport with the audience. It can certainly make a point if you have the appropriate joke at the right time, or the appropriate line at the right time. There are dangers of it, one of which I said is it can distract, it can be offensive, it can lower your credibility quite a bit. It can play havoc with what you're actually saying and keep people from paying too much attention. So it is possible to go too far in one direction, to be too funny, and then it becomes a comedy act and not an actual presentation on your topic. So as much as it's fun to get an audience laughing, also keep in mind that you want to try to keep people on track as much as possible with your topic. You'll see some quotes actually through this. The first quote on the first page here, at the bottom, is actually from Malcolm Kushner. Your goal is to be perceived as a serious professional who has a healthy sense of humor. The appropriate seventh sense, you might say. The other quotes I have, and quotes are a real big thing. I'm going to talk a lot about those as we get towards the very end here. Laughter is the shortest distance between two people. That's from Victor Morgan. That's an actual quote. But take a look at the next quote. The best solutions to problems can come from putting odd things together and making them work. Dr. B. Frankenstein. Now, he didn't really say that. Or at least, I don't think he really said that. But making up quotes, as you'll see, is a very useful humor tool in a way of actually getting points across. I'll talk a little bit more about that as I mentioned. Okay, so really here, there are ways to insert humor intentionally and ways that'll happen unintentionally. Intentionally, you want to put in, like I said, relevant pieces. So a cartoon can be very appropriate. The New Yorker has a data bank of cartoons that you can purchase for use in presentations. And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not giving you legal advice, but a lot of people just use cartoons that they find anyway in their presentations. And as long as they're not selling them, they tend not to get in trouble with that. I wouldn't suggest you do that unless you are fairly certain of that. But sometimes you do find cartoons that are just appropriate. You can sometimes get permission to use them, and sometimes not. A lot of college professors use, as many of you may know, use cartoons all the time in their presentations. I can guarantee that none of us ever get permission for those when we're using them. But you sometimes get some other things out of the cartoons, even sometimes the lines that come out of that. You want to find only relevant things, though, things that are actually illustrating points. They should be adapted to your audience. So if you're talking to a group of seniors, your humor may be a little bit different than if you're talking to a group of 20-year-olds or to kids. Because humor is going to be generational to some extent, and references are generational too. So even quotes that you give may not be gotten by everybody. The one thing you never should do is explain a joke. That's important. The other thing you should never do is just throw a cartoon up with a caption and let the audience read it. Or a quote and let the audience read it. You should always read the caption, read the quote, because people read at different speeds and you want them all to get the joke at the same time. So that's an important point with any kind of visual humor that you happen to be using. You want to make sure that if you are going to use jokes, that they are appropriate. Because the problem that I always see is people often, first of all, say, let me tell you a joke. Well, let me start off with a joke. Never announce you're going to tell a joke. That's kind of the dumbest thing that anybody can do, because then if the joke falls flat, everybody knows that you meant it as a joke, and now you can't tell a joke. If you just do it, they might think it's a funny story that they didn't get or something else, but it's not a big deal. All right? So never announce that. If you don't have the timing, then don't do it. I mean, and really, don't throw full jokes in there. However, humorous anecdotes, things that have funny punches to the actual stories, are not a bad idea to deal with. Also, if you tell a joke, it should be relevant and it shouldn't be offensive. And one of the most difficult things about making jokes non-offensive is if you're talking about, and there are a lot of jokes about different people from different countries and different professions. If I was going to tell a joke about accountants, I could offend accountants in the audience, and so on. So Malcolm and I, talking about this years ago, came up with the idea of telling the same joke about Martians. Because if there are any Martians in the audience, too bad. You know, they're not identifying themselves as such, so I don't really care if they get offended or not. If somebody turns green and walks out at this point, I'll understand. That's all right. It's very important in certain subjects. You really may have to take your subject seriously. I've known people talking about breast cancer. It's a very serious subject, but if the speaker doesn't take themselves seriously, they can still easily inject humor even in the most serious subject. Self-effacing humor is really good. So making fun of yourself a little bit can help quite a bit with everything you do. And to do that, sometimes it's just a matter of acknowledging mistakes that you make. If you trip and fall, you know, in my case, I talk about, you heard them mention I'm a parapsychologist, I talk about the paranormal, I talk about ghosts. I can always blame it on a ghost to trip me. Usually get a little laugh from that. I can also throw in jokes like that. Anybody know what you call a haunted chicken coop? Poultrygeist. If anybody's been up to USS Hornet up in Alameda, aircraft carrier, it's haunted. And one of the most common things that happens there is that women get their bottoms pinched. That's a poltergoose. Now, puns happen to be, as groaning as they are, one of the best uses of humor you can possibly find. Because if everybody groans, everybody was paying attention. And there's usually a groan and a slight laugh after that. So puns are a very, very good thing. And that doesn't mean you overuse them. That's the key, is not to overuse any of this. Consider your speaking persona. You want to come across as likable. Again, don't take yourself too seriously. I always tell people that I do take my subject seriously, more or less, but I'm kind of the Bill Murray character from Ghostbusters. So I'm more likely to kid around a little bit about the subject and about myself than anything else. And that, strangely enough, gives me more credibility even with the skeptics of my field. Not quite sure how that worked out, but it does work out that way. All right, so adding humor is kind of interesting because the idea is you typically are adding humor. So when you build your presentation, you build the serious stuff first, the information first. However, as you're building it, even though I have on this sheet to build the serious stuff first, consider that if something occurs to you that is amusing, something that comes from a previous presentation you did or from someone else's presentation, put it in at that time. This is not a strict rule. There are no strict rules here at all. You want to then go back over and add humor at appropriate points. And what appropriate can be is sometimes when you've talked about the subject seriously for a while and you want a little break for the audience, like a little breather. It can be because one of the points you make happens to have a relevant bit of humor you can throw in. It can be a number of different things. There is no set pattern. You shouldn't do humor, plan out to do humor. Every 5 PowerPoint slides should be a funny quote. Don't do that. Make it non-regular, non-monotonous. Don't have a pattern people can figure out for that. And like I said, if you do come up with something that makes people laugh, whether you make a joke about it or not, absolutely positively write it down if you can recreate it, because you can plan that in for next time. A lot of the things that I've done over the years have fallen into my lectures now as really funny things that I accidentally said or ad-libbed at the moment. For me, it's actually pretty easy when I have things like equipment failing during my lecture at colleges, where I've lectured at colleges. I'm talking about ghosts, so I can make lots of jokes about that. Somebody's following me around, they don't want me to present here. And I've actually been in some schools where everything has started failing, which has become kind of a very, very humorous situation with the audience, because I'm willing to play with it. That also means you have to be adaptable. Some speakers make a big mistake of, unfortunately, freaking out if things don't go their way. So you always want to be ready to speak without a microphone, without anything, and then everything is an add-on for that. The other thing is, if any of you do have a fear of public speaking, there's an author by the name of Ron Hoff who wrote a great book called I Can See You Naked, about presentation skills. Wonderful book. That comes from the old stereotype that if you have stage fright, you imagine your audience naked. Problem with that is, if you're a speaker doing that, you're going to get either too interested or too disgusted in some of the audience members. It's going to distract you, actually. So, not a good idea in that sense. In times of crisis, it is of the utmost importance not to lose one's head. Marie Antoinette. There are some things you're just born to do. See Kent, reporter for the Daily Planet. Again, quotes you made up. All right, so in adding things in, you can find jokes that are funny and relevant, but they should be appropriate, they should be short. If you're going to spend time telling a story, it should be a story, an anecdote, a humorous thing that is either from your experience or from someone else's, not a joke. So keep the jokes short. It actually helps use old jokes. If you can go back into old vaudevillians and find some of the old jokes, they even work with newer audiences. They're a little bit funny, a little bit silly. Do a little Rodney Dangerfield, a little Henny Youngman. Sometimes you can find an appropriate line. And looking at old films, or any film, quoting from motion pictures. Someone was talking about having a degree in film. It's a great place to find quotes, especially quoting those particular characters in those. The cartoons, again, read the captions as you're going through, but find the most appropriate cartoons. The New Yorker does have a great bank. There are other cartoon banks online. You can usually search by subject to find cartoons having to do with your particular topic. And they cost very little money to get the license for to use in presentations, or even to reprint on handouts, for that matter. Props are an interesting thing. Some speakers I've seen come out and they'll slam a wiffle bat or a plastic baseball bat on the table to get people's attention, or they'll do some very, very unusual prop humor, pull out a rope and cut it in half and talk about unlinking things and putting them together. They might play with different visuals. And props can be used for humor or just to simply make a point. And along with props are magic tricks. Now, anybody here, Ken does a little bit of magic. Anybody here do magic at all? No? That's okay. What I want to suggest is that there are very simple visual tricks that anybody can do, that if you want to insert a visual, one of the places to look for a visual prop is actually an online magic shop. Because there's some very, very simple, big, unusual props you can find that are very cheap typically to illustrate a point. And that is one way that a lot of top speakers will throw in the magic. We're talking about transformation. Think about talking about transformation, having a scarf turn from one color to another. That's about the easiest trick you can possibly do. So there are some very, very simple things that will get attention and also get a little bit of a laugh from time to time. Puns I've already mentioned. The punnier you can be sometimes, again, puns can be often very natural, and puns are something that is genetic in my family typically. So everybody on both sides of the family, unfortunately, at family dinners are a little bit too punny for words. So I keep track. This is where I usually, in some of my presentations, will say something that just simply occurs when somebody asks me a question. There's just something that pops in my head, and I'll keep track of that and then insert it later in my presentation. It does get a groan, but it gets a laugh too. You can also do things like surveys, which can include puns or not. Let me do a quick survey here. How many of you believe in ESP? Raise your hands. Extra sensory perception. Okay. How many believe in UFOs? That should be everybody. A UFO is an unidentified flying object. So if you see something in the sky, you don't know what it is, that's a UFO. How many people believe in UFOs? There we go. Okay. How many people believe in Bigfoot? Bigfoot. All right, how many people believe in big feet? And how many people believe in mind over matter? Raise my hand. That's good. So you can do little surveys and about almost anything, and just whatever your topic is, you can always find something to make it a little bit humorous. Try to make it a little about yourself at the very end, be a little funny about that. And it's a way of, again, engaging the audience and keeping them going. There are definitions. There are books of humorous definitions, funny dictionaries you can find. And those kinds of things are great. Or you can make up definitions for words as much as you like. One great source, which is free on Google Books and archive.org, is Ambrose Bierce's The Devil's Dictionary. This is a book that he was a humor writer in the late 19th, early 20th century, who actually wrote with Pancho Villa for a time. And he wrote this book called The Devil's Dictionary, which is all sorts of humorous very on-point definitions. And that's a great one to use stuff from. Anecdotes, great source.